everyone, and welcome to our debate. Today I'm joined by one of our Criminology and Public Services lecturers, Don Entwistle. He's going to start us off on talking about our debate today, which is all about knife crime, and particularly in focus in Greater Manchester, which is where we are based. Don, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself and kick us off.
Yeah, thank you. So my name's Don Entwistle, and I teach across 3 different degrees: a criminology degree, public service, and integrated health. And you might wonder what's all that got to do with knife crime. So we'll come to that in a minute. But just thinking about, graduate entrance. So when you finished doing your degree with us, you will probably be applying to do graduate level jobs in public services or the private sector. So, but when you do a graduate entry job, you get asked to do some big things very early on as part of a team. So the one that you might get asked to do, and we're using this as an example today, would be about the major problems of knife crime in Greater Manchester. So if you were interested in that at the moment, you just need to look at the current papers and the news media about Croydon, Rochdale and Manchester, where there's been a real uptick in knife crime just recently. But this is the kind of task, if we go back to it, where you'd be expected to work as part of a team, and you can see it's very important work that can save lives, very important, and can help communities. And what they would probably be asking you to do is to help in the research to develop appropriate solutions, because appropriate solutions are better than knee-jerk reactions that will fail and could be very damaging. So that's really important. The research side of something as big as this is really important. So we go to the next slide. Question we're going to ask ourselves is knife crime a criminal justice issue, or is it more of a public health problem? You might think, what, public health? But we'll come back to that. Or is it a mixture of different solutions by a variety of agencies? So you probably think, yeah, that's probably where we're going with that one. Yeah. So just moving on a bit. It's incredible, this, but Glasgow, which is just up the road from here in Scotland, the World Health Organization said in 2005 it was the murder capital of Europe. That's incredible. That a city not very far from us in Scotland was the murder capital of Europe. And they had 141 murders in 1 year, of which 41 were in Glasgow. So obviously, Police Scotland, or at that time Glasgow City Police, couldn't allow this to continue. And they recognised that an enforcement issue, the enforcement and policing on its own was not the long-term solution. So they had to think about some other ways of thinking about knife crime. And so they thought about it, considered it, and decided that a public health approach and developing a violence reduction unit was important. And they did international comparison and research with what was called the Boston Ceasefire Initiative. That was in Boston in America, not in Lincolnshire, let's be clear. Boston in America. Obviously, you'll have heard about gang violence in America. And in Boston, they had a ceasefire initiative in which they worked with gangs and individuals. So Police Scotland borrowed some of that approach, but developed their own unique approach based on public health and developing a violence reduction unit. And this is a new innovative approach involving agencies from housing, health, education and addiction services, and quite a lot more actually. So, they're beginning to realise very quickly that policing on its own, in policing prosecution, imprisonment has not worked in reducing this high level of knife crime. So we move on. Police Scotland, or Glasgow City Police as it was then, now there's one unified police force in Scotland called Police Scotland, and they've taken this on. But they developed a clear focus on street-based gang violence, which is clearly where a lot of knife crime was happening. They looked also at domestic abuse and looked at some of the issues about school-based bullying, which might have led on later on to knife crime. So developing a clear focus was really important here. If we move on a bit, so when we start thinking about where we are, Greater Manchester, we're starting to look at the statistics, and just because you're going to be university students, quantitative research, we're looking at the facts and statistics, is a really important way of looking at a problem. So we can see in Greater Manchester between 2015 and 2018, knife crime rose by 89%. Now that might mean, yeah, it rose by 89%, or that we're better means of reporting knife crime. So I think it's a combination of both. But whatever it is, it's a dramatic increase in knife crime. And in 2018, which is the statistics we've got up to date, reported knife crime offences, there was 6,196. And half these offences were committed by men in the 15 to 19 age range. So we can see men, it's mostly men. And 1 in 10, one in 10 in percentage terms, were committed by the 15 to 19 age range. So you can see it's young men, and a big portion of it, 1 in 10, is between 15 and 19. So we're already focusing our research on this area. And just to remind you, your statistics that you collect can tell us about place, that's where this happened, the location, was it in school, was it on the street, was it in a home, the time of offence, that's very important. Were there any issues of ethnicity or gender or sexuality in this? So the statistics, if there's a proper, adequate recording system, we can get a lot of statistics that will help us understand what's happening here and help us with our appropriate responses. If we just move on a bit from that. The thing is about statistics, colleagues, is sometimes it doesn't allow us to focus on the individual. So we use case studies as well. We call this qualitative data. And the question is why this is important. The reason why it's important, of course, is because it focuses on real people, real situations. And if you're interested in this, you need to go onto a site called Beyond the Blade, which is a record of every individual killed through knife crime in London. And the person who authored this is now the Professor of Sociology at Manchester University called Gary Young. But Beyond the Blade kind of made sure that this every individual would not be forgotten. At the same time, case studies allows us to find out who the perpetrators of knife crime are. But remember, perpetrators can also be victims. So that's what we know as well. Descriptions of perpetrators and victims can also be the same person. And we're going to look at families, certainly the consequence, the horrific consequences on families, on communities, and the effect on communities. And if we use both sets of data, both the qualitative and quantitative research, it keeps this issue both in the public and the political eye, which is really important here, that we can't let this go. We can't say, oh, it's young people, it's knife crime, they're involved in drugs and other issues. What do you expect? rather than thinking these are real issues, these are really young people, very young people. We need to make sure the public keep an eye on it, and politically it becomes a really important priority rather than something that people forget. So I think those are key issues that we need to think about in relationship to knife crime. If we want to see... Hello.
Sorry, Don, can I ask a question? I guess
Sure.
When you're talking about that 15 to 19 age group, is there any studies kind of done on, obviously that impacts both sides, both the victims, but also those who are perpetrating the crime as well, aren't they? And is there any kind of data or view on kind of how that then sets up those people for life, for reoffending, etc. as well,
yeah,
if they're offending so young?
Sure, there's a lot of studies that show that, well, firstly, the studies show that early intervention prevents long-term criminality. So the earlier we intervene in these issues, the less likelihood that people are going to kind of get into long-term criminality, which will end up in prison with long-term prison sentences, which makes it very, very hard for people to get out of that. And all the questions we now know about in terms of future employment and stability, this kind of can blight people's lives forever. So there's a lot of studies around that. I think, just to go back to Beyond the Blade, if students or prospective students were able to look at that, it would really educate them about the numbers of young people and the consequences as well. So that's really important. And in some areas, there are particular issues. So in London, the numbers of black young people who are both perpetrators and victims has been very, very high. But in other instances, and all big cities have a problem with knife crime, and it's not only in cities. And perhaps we should say also it's not based on ethnicity, except in some particular areas. So if we were thinking about Glasgow, well, Glasgow is almost 98% white, if you remember, if we go back to that. So this is really not about ethnicity, but in some situations, we need to think about it in that perspective, what's going on here. So that's the kind of issue about where we are in terms of reviewing progress. So we just moved on a bit. What we're interested really is what in our neck of the woods in Greater Manchester, what have Greater Manchester done? Now we've got a combined authority in Greater Manchester, so that's all the boroughs in Greater Manchester working together. We have an elected mayor called Andy Burnham, who you might have heard of, been very prominent recently. And Greater Manchester have borrowed from Police Scotland the public health approach to knife crime. And they've also developed a violence reduction unit. Is reduction spelled? I will come back to that. It's a bad spelling, sorry. Oh, anyway, something went wrong with the spelling there. It's a violence reduction unit to address the problem. And the thing about this is that why public health approaches is really important is because we see that knife crime is a preventable disease. So once you view it in that context, you take it out of purely and simply it's a police responsibility, and it becomes a much wider responsibility. And that means we provide lots of other agencies and encourage lots of other agencies to become involved in this. So we've now got a public health approach borrowed from Police Scotland. We've now got a violence reduction unit, and we've got this concept that violence is a preventable disease. And we've already, Greater Manchester Combined Authority have undertaken research that kind of gives us some real insight into victims and perpetrators who we've said may be both. So that's important to think that people who are victims may also be people who are perpetrators of this. And because we've focused on this, in Greater Manchester, this study has excluded domestic violence, which is another major issue, but we might begin to cloud up our research if we involve too much. And we've kept out organised crime, which is a very different issue. So we've really focused on young people and young adults, which I think is really important, given what we know about from the statistics we've just looked at. Okay, so if we just move on a bit further from that, the research findings are, I'm sure you know this, social media are drivers of knife crime. So what happens on social media in terms of the way people communicate with each other can incite young people to get into conflict. And we now know that we need to be careful. Social media companies need to be very careful in particular in allowing this kind of what you might call hate crime. I think that might be a good term for it, to kind of be engendered through social media that drives people to commit violence against one another. And another one which was really important is, we'll come back to that in a minute, but one of the concerns was that some young people and communities and families were growing up in communities and neighbourhoods where violence is normalised, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then one of the key issues that's been kind of highlighted is that what we've had in Greater Manchester, as we have in all police forces because of austerity, is major cuts in policing. So we've had a reduction in police numbers of 2,000 warranted officers. That means that the key component of policing, which was neighbourhood policing, has been reduced because police have to focus on what considered to be more urgent 999 calls, particularly emergency calls, and other very high priority like organised crime. But the consequence of that is the police officers you might have seen in the street, you might have talked to, young people might have got to know, have been much reduced. And then you have to think, has there been adequate police responses? So if you're interested, have a look at the recent HMI reports on Greater Manchester Police, which don't make very good reading. Greater Manchester Police have got to improve dramatically because of some serious failings in reportage and intervention. So the police have got to up their game a lot. And what the big thing, of course, is this question of normalisation. So what the research says, that vulnerability and fear creates normalisation of carrying knives and violence. So that's the big worry, is normalisation. That if young people think it's normal to carry knives, then it takes it out of what you might call gang violence, which is very limited, and it begins to spread into just normal youth culture. So that's the real worry.
John, on that, yeah. I know at the start you discussed a bit about how you looked at Boston and how they addressed kind of gun violence in the States. Would you say that this is kind of a bit of like the UK's version of gun violence, and especially talking to that point of what you were just talking about, there is that fear and normalisation of almost, well, I'm worried I'm going to be attacked by somebody with a knife, therefore I should protect myself. Is that the kind of thing similar to how gun violence works in the States?
Yeah, I think that, you know, what you've had in some American cities, as you probably know, is some serious issues around violence. And I think that the project they looked at brought together gangs and got them to have dialogue with each other around violence cessation and about reduction in gun violence. And, you know, the consequences of that in terms of murder and, you know, mayhem in communities. I think you've got to come back to young people and talk to them about that. So I think the British version of that is you're right, that knives have got the potential to become normalised. Now, in terms of, we've got such a kind of the barrier for young people to carry guns. We know that the sentencing is so high that people obviously, to get access to guns is very difficult, but also the fear of the sentence, that if you were caught with a gun, you automatically get a 5-year prison sentence. So it may be that young people think, well, we won't carry guns, but we'll get less sentence and less punishment if we carry knives. But the big issue, as you say, is normalisation, i.e. we need to carry knives just to protect ourselves. And that's a big fear.
I guess as well, it kind of works out twofold, doesn't it, then, in terms of you want to raise awareness for issues as such like this, but then again, as you see in the US especially, things, because it's so heavily reported on in the media, it becomes so normal, and so, like you were saying, the fear is there, isn't it? So it makes you more worried, and kind of it's quite cyclical in that sense, isn't it? I don't know, we've got Bill here as well. I don't know, Bill, if you want to come in on that from potentially a bit of, I know you've got a policing background.
Right.
Is that all right, Bill?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, apologies for coming in late. I had some horrible IT issues this afternoon. So,
it's all good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you want to introduce yourself and a bit about your background? Because I think it would be good for people to understand where you're coming from, especially with the police background, isn't it?
Okay, so yeah, my name's Bill Mundy. I'm a criminology lecturer at UCEN. My background is Greater Manchester Police, funnily enough. Don's just been talking about them. I was a police officer for 30 years, all in city centre and the surrounding areas of Manchester, and involved with sort of policing of gangs and drugs and inner city areas for most of my career. So I've seen it from a policing point of view. Knife crime for me isn't something that's new. It's been going on for perhaps a couple of 100 years in Manchester, really. Even historically, a lot of the youth have carried weapons. But where I think is different in recent history is exactly what Don alluded to there, with almost a pop culture, and referred to it as normalisation of carrying knives. From a policing point of view, the main issues with that are certainly, I think Don just touched on it there, is availability of knives. It's a completely different story than guns, in that you can pick one up in any home. You can walk in and pick up a knife that's used in the kitchen, which is a potential lethal weapon. So availability is very, very easy to buy them on shops, internet, supermarkets, or even from your own home. So from that point of view, that gives a big problem. Restricting sales of knives is virtually impossible. I know there has been some attempts through legislation to restrict the sale and to make sure it's sold to the right people, but very, very difficult. So that's one issue. Policing it is a big problem as well, from the breakdown of neighbourhood policing, which is a problem getting into youth at an early stage and involved in education. With the reduce on numbers, it's very much a police service that just responds to incidents now. So in effect, to deal with knife crime, maybe that's too late an intervention. Well, certainly it is too late an intervention. Few tools. Don't mention the court system, which is fairly not very effective because of poor sentencing with regards knife crime. The other big tool really for the police is stop and search regarding knife crime, which I find interesting that sort of over the years it's sort of public opinion has sort of altered a little bit with stop and search from being totally against the use of it to it's actually come back in to be lauded as a valuable tool for dealing with knife crime. Certainly in London, I know quite a few of the communities there are asking for more stop and search, which is sort of quite a big turnaround. But there is problems on either side for stop and search. One from the public, and seeing disproportionate stop and search to certain communities is still a very sensitive issue. And for the policing, there is issues with police officers frightened to use stop and search because of complaints of being sort of disproportionate and racist against the police. So the numbers have dropped, or certainly had dropped, on the use of stop and search. So again, no quick fix there. I think the only solutions potentially are longer term solutions and education and culture change, which is not an easy thing to do. So that's sort of my brief summary.
Yeah, I guess on culture change, this links in as well. Do you mind just muting, Bill? There's getting a bit of echo.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we've actually had a question from one of our attendees. Jen has said, you mentioned that media reporting of knife crime. To what extent do you think knife crime is a moral panic?
No, I don't think it's a moral panic at all. I think it's a real issue, and I direct your colleague that's put the question. If she thinks it's a moral panic, she should just look at Beyond the Blade, which is that account of what's happened in London, and she should just look today at the newspapers around Croydon, Rochdale and Manchester, where you can see in Croydon there's been in the last 24 hours 2 murders and a lot of people being stabbed. So there was gang violence between Manchester and Rochdale, which has just come into play, in which somebody got murdered in Rochdale just before Christmas to do with gang culture. So it's not a moral panic, it's actually a major real issue, and it needs the kind of focus, I think, that we're talking about in terms of public health. And the government, I haven't put this in the slide, but you could research this. The government have just put a lot more money just recently into the public health approach and violence reduction approach to knife crime. So the government are recognising that, as Bill said, that policing on its own will not resolve this, and you have to put lots of effort into other kind of areas. So if I could just go into those briefly, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Just to move on to them. So just the research findings, just to finish that bit off, was something about this, what we call toxic masculinity, which means that you're kind of building this idea that men cannot be insulted without retaliation. You've got to prove how big you are and how tough you are. And this is often incited through social media. So young men of 14 and 15, 16, 17, as it says in the research, can be very influenced by a culture of masculinity. That and that means that they get into violence when they don't need to. And then the last bit of this is about creating safe spaces. So the most important thing is, and Bill has got another side to him which you might want to comment on, is safe spaces means all the things that young people used to be able to do prior to austerity. Youth services were very important for 11 to 14, 15, 16-year-olds. Football, which Bill's got another passion for, and was very involved in football. But if you just thought about football, amateur football, all those teams that young people were involved in, that meant they had to train first. They had to be involved with responsible adults who were training them. Then they had to compete, and then they had to obey rules and get the disciplines around football. And it just occupies people's time. Now, if you take those little infrastructures away, football's one example. There's all the other ones about youth safe spaces, in which young people were meeting, responsible adults, older young people themselves who've been involved in that youth project. You create that space which is safe, and you create dialogue. So I think that's a very important issue that's been, because of austerity, those kind of areas of safe spaces where young people could meet across communities from 11 to 16, that's probably the age range that they would go to youth provision, maybe up to 17. But all the other places that they would go to in terms of football particularly, but lots of other sports as well.
I think there's a bit of historical sort of precedence with that as well. If you sort of go back to 1850s-ish, Manchester and Salford, an awful problem with gangs using knives, and a lot of serious incidents at that time with gangs fighting. What's turned out to be the big turning point in that was not sentencing or heavier policing or whatever. It was creation of lads clubs. So really, if you want to look at an historical example, exactly the same thing happened sort of 150 years ago, and the solution was diversionary constructive things for the youth. Yeah.
Well, I think we all know that there's kind of been a bit of obviously, Don, you alluded to it before as well when you were talking about austerity and cuts to police, but largely also there's been some big cuts to kind of community services, lads clubs, as you say, Bill, as well. So I guess it is a really interesting thing to consider when you're looking at this public health approach, how much those kind of constructive, positive social spaces compared to kind of negative ones, and how much they play a role.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the research findings just kind of saying, look, we need to focus on creating safe spaces in all different communities for young people to meet, and the crucial age is 11 to 16 and 17. We'll come back to that in a minute. So if we could just moving on for a little while. So where are we now? And I think this is really important to just think where we're up to now. So we've now got this public health approach, and we've got what's called a violence reduction strategy. So that's important. We've got in Greater Manchester, we've got a violence reduction unit with a variety of agencies under the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. So that, the combined authority of all the different boroughs in Greater Manchester working together under the authority of the mayor have got this violence reduction unit. And as Bill said that stop and search has gone down, but actually it's gone up recently because of the knife crime issues. Stop and search has gone up by 243% just fairly recently. So,
yeah, from a very low point though, Don, was the issue, I think, because of lack of use of it, and now it's on the thought of as a valuable tool again. But you're right.
Probably goes back to as well with the reporting of it, of the crimes themselves as well, doesn't it? When you kind of alluded to at the start, didn't you, Don, about has it gone up because it's actually more prevalent, or is it reporting just better? Yeah. I mean, in terms of stop and search, there's got to be, the police have got to accurately record stop and search. But so stop and search has been controversial because, as Bill said, the issues of disproportionality, i.e., has stop and search been used against Black and Asian young people more than sort of white young people? Counter arguments are that the stop and search has been used in areas where there's been instances of knife crime, irrespective of race or ethnicity. And it just happens to be in those areas that are higher concentrations of young people who are Black or Asian heritage. So, but whatever it is, as Bill said, maybe it was from a very low point, but it's gone up. And from being one that was kind of
kind of viewed in a negative way. As Bill said, stop and search has come right back in because it's seen as an effective weapon. Oh, that's the wrong word. Sorry, an effective approach to preventing knife crime. So one of our students, for instance, has been sitting on a panel with British Transport Police. She's doing the honours degree in criminology in the 3rd year, and she sat on a panel for British Transport Police who were keen to get young people's perceptions of the way that they used interventions in stop and search. So she was able to sit on this panel and view the camera, you know, the image that was taken by the cameras that the police have got, the body cameras, and she could talk to them about advising them about the way that they use stop and search and was it appropriate and did they approach particularly young people properly. So that was really interesting for me. That, one of our students doing the criminology degree was asked where she got onto that panel with British Transport Police, and it showed me that the police were very interested. Okay, we're going to apply stop and search, but we want to see that there's a kind of accountability and a transparency about it, which is important. So we've had a reduction in recorded instances of knife crime, 23%. But I think you have to think about that that statistic because it's a very variable statistic. It can look very good, and then you get a whole batch of knife crime issues, and it goes up dramatically. So you just I think you need to keep your eye on the statistics around this. And also, it's worth looking at the newspaper reports where I think knife crime gets much more prominence now because we realise the seriousness of it. So the question is like this is clearly getting all this sorted out. The public health approach, the violence reduction strategies. It's only a start, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. And that's clearly the important issue. So just thinking about, you know, kind of finishing it off a bit. So one of the things that both Police Scotland, our colleagues from America, and hopefully Greater Manchester have adopted is something called active mobilisation. What that really means, there's no bystanders to violence, so that this is a communal problem. It's not something that the police have to deal with on their own. It's a communal problem, and it's our problem that we have to deal with. So once we start thinking about it like that, then obviously the public health approach and the violence reduction strategy and all the issues that we've talked about in relationship to wider communal issues become relevant. And this term social capital, it's one of my favourites. Social capital sounds a bit kind of, what does that mean? Well, it really means building youth organisations and sports clubs and all the clubs that Bill's alluded to. But the thing about social capital, it means it builds young people and it builds adults in those communities to work together in a very meaningful way around youth programs and youth projects right across the board for whatever they are. It might be the Army Cadets, it might be the Sea Cadets, it might be the Scouts, it might be the Girl Guides, it might be youth projects. Greater Manchester Police had a youth cadet scheme that some of our students previously were involved in, which I thought was really interesting. That I think, unfortunately, as part of the cuts, that didn't survive. But having a youth cadet scheme for Greater Manchester Police meant that young people could be involved at a low level in policing, could undertake some, you know, could get a uniform, could go on parade, could get some training, could take part in some activities. You know, if there was a parade, for instance, or something, you know, they could take part in it and help and work on it. And it just brought, you know, so much kind of, you know, young people and policing together. Now, that's just one of them around that term social capital. So I think it's a really interesting term, social capital. And then the big one in terms of thinking about the public health approach is about supportive relationships through intense mentoring and counselling. So those young people who've unfortunately got caught up in youth violence, what our public health approach and violence reduction strategy teaches us is they need intense mentoring and they need counselling. So mentoring means all kinds of different things. And we know that, for instance, one of the mentoring schemes that they've been developing in London is actually young people as mentors, young people helping other young people. So I think that's a really interesting and very potentially very productive way of addressing this issue. I'd like to see how that is being developed in Greater Manchester. We'll have to come back to that at some time to see how that's being developed. And then the big connection around developing relationships between agencies is the public health approach, Isabel. So looking at connections between the police, prison and probation. So obviously prison and probation, this is for people who have actually committed offences but come out of prison. So we need to think about how does the prison experience work? Do we focus on rehabilitation when they're under probation? Do they get the right support and help within the probation period? And then the questions that have always come up are around housing and around health, education, employment. So those kind of varieties of structures and agencies that deal with that all need to come together to build connections under the public health approach, so that we have this violence reduction strategy that works effectively. So I'm kind of thinking that, I've talked a lot, and I just wondered, were there any, probably too much actually, but if there were any other comments or any other
we've got a couple of questions. So one from Laura, who's asked about kind of what the proportion of knife crime is as a result of kind of self-defense versus people like choosing revenge essentially as their motive, and how that kind of plays out, I guess. Because I guess as well, obviously then the police response, all those kinds of things, then the catalysts are completely different if it's self-defense versus if it's kind of a revenge or like a premeditated thought, isn't it? Yeah,
well, in some ways that's not actually accurate in a way. Right. What I mean by that is, just contradicting you slightly, is if we go back to the original stuff that we talked about, young people who are caught up in knife crime can be both victims and perpetrators. So self-defense, we have to be careful about that, because actually, if you carry a knife, you're likely to, once you carry a knife, you're much more likely to be hurt as a result of knife crime. So the first thing is, you're much more likely to be a victim. Like the statistics show, you carry a knife, the percentage of possibility of you being injured or seriously hurt or even murdered goes up dramatically. And secondly, if you carry a knife, you're also more likely to be a perpetrator. So the question about defense, I understand it, but it's not really, it's not a...
I guess you, by carrying it in some way, you're essentially mentally premeditating that you might have to use it, aren't you? That's what you're kind of saying, isn't it, Dom?
Yeah.
The fact that you're armed and you're ready to go in that, if that case arises, suggests that you're willing to do that, doesn't it?
That's right. So if you haven't got a knife in the first place, then if you might get involved in a confrontation, but you can't escalate it. Most likely you'll de-escalate it, because you're not going to escalate it into some kind of confrontation. It might end up in fisticuffs or a slap or something. Like that's what young men do sometimes, but it doesn't get worse.
Yeah.
So it's the carrying of the knife, real issue around here, and the self-defense argument might stand up in court. You know, you defended yourself, but actually, it's a very dubious area. I don't know if Bill wants to comment on that at all.
Well, only to say, Don, from it wouldn't be, it would not be something that was ever recorded, whether people claim to use the knife because somebody else had a knife. In order to plead self-defense, technically for the law, then it's only using as much force as is necessary in the circumstances. So in order to do that, the only really way you could plead self-defense with a knife is if you were about to be stabbed or attacked with a knife and you picked up the instrument off the floor or something like that. Having it with you beforehand would not fit into a defence, a legal defence in those circumstances. So it's not something that you could ever differentiate to that extent. Statistically, I don't think there will be very, very few successful pleas, if any, of self-defense of somebody who's carrying a knife.
Yeah,
that's
an interesting point, isn't it? I've also got another point from Jen as well, back on kind of a bit to do with stop and search, but also kind of the potential risks of looking at kind of re-employing stop and search and kind of almost rebranding it as a new tactic under public health, and how that kind of, I guess, potentially actually drives a bigger wedge between the trust between community and police when it comes to the overarching public health strategy.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. So the public health approach means lots of different agencies are going to be involved to start with. So you're going to get this kind of partnership across, you know, some of the agencies. Like, for instance, you know, you'd have partnerships around education and training. You'd have partnerships around housing. You'd have partnerships around, you know, education in terms of school-based education. So you kind of get all these partnerships, and certainly around the health service, which has been a really important partnership. So you'd see all those taking place, and then stop and search would be one of those strategies. So, for instance, if you look at Croydon, this big upsurge in knife crime in Croydon, they've put a section order in that's allowed them to have limited use of knife crime, stop and search, in a for a limited period of time. So when there's you can use stop and search, and I think, you know, Bill will correct me if I'm slightly out of not quite right, but you can use stop and search for specific and limited periods of time. It doesn't have to be, you know, forever. It can be used because you might be concerned about an area or an uptick in knife crime. You need to apply a whole range of different issues.
Yeah, you're right, Don. Yeah, there's two different types: stop and search on suspicion, which can be done anytime, and then a special order, like say normally granted by an inspector for a specific time and area. And on that, you don't need suspicion. It's a blanket stop and search, exactly for that type of incident.
I guess, does the issue then arise then when those kind of blanket orders are in place, but obviously it then feels still like it's a profiling exercise, I guess? Like, is that used? It might be a blanket approach, but is it being used in a blanket way?
Yes, yeah, it would be. It would be used as a preventative method, where following on from in a small area, so it'd be confined to an area after incidents had already happened. So it would be a way of preventing further, and it would only be limited to 24, 48-hour period of time. So a small preventative method, and only on extra authority to prevent, you know, the misuse of it.
Yeah. That's interesting. I guess kind of going back to then as well, what you were just saying before, obviously this is public health has kind of this, if you're then looking at it as an all-encompassing strategy which has many different strands, with people having a negative perception of the police and their response to this at times, do you think it's important for that strand of the police at some times to almost really sit separately rather than being part of it and potentially spreading that mistrust, I guess, between some of the other agencies involved? Because if you've got a bad relationship with the police, say a specific community, does that then, and you know that they're working closely with the NHS or a community or like services, whatever it might be, do you think that then potentially has risk to kind of bleed into their inability to trust the other services? It's a nice complex question for you.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that. In my previous life, before I was a lecturer, I used to work on a lot of those partnerships. You know, for instance, so some of those partnerships were really important. And if I just give you an example, where I worked, I was a training special projects officer, which covered youth services. And one of the tasks was one of the responsibilities was in one of the youth in Hyde, which is just down the road from Manchester. All these youth clubs used to come together to go ice skating in Stockport. What was interesting about that was there were 3 coach loads go maybe twice a year or 3 times a year. And the local police, the neighbourhood police, used to go with them, not as police officers in uniform, but as the local police thought it was part and parcel of their responsibilities and duties to just kind of come. And young people used to really like having what they call the cops with them. Thought it was amazing. Cops would come. So you can see that when neighbourhood policing was working, you had that kind of familiarity with young people. So when I know that what police officers told me when they had to act in a policing role with young people, sometimes they had to, you know, act in a policing role with the same young people. Those young people were much more likely to accept and to be trusting of them. They may not have liked what the police were doing, probably didn't, you know, in terms of either telling them off, taking them home, or even arresting them, you know, for some offence. At least they knew the police, and so that kind of worked things out. So I think if you've got neighbourhood policing working alongside the public health approach, you will get much more trust built up. So the problem for policing is the reduction, I think, in neighbourhood policing, and that's just one aspect of it. I mean, I know Bill maybe wants to comment on that, but the other aspects of those we go back to are too with social capital issues around all those youth provisions that have gone. If we can build that back, as it were, I know that's a new, build back better, that's a new stocking phrase, isn't it? Build back better. If we can build back neighbourhood policing on the one hand and build back youth organisations and this concept of social capital, I think it will have a dramatic effect on youth crime, particularly on violent crime and particularly on knife crime. I don't know if Bill wants to comment on that.
Well, I'd agree with you, really, Don. For me, it's completely the opposite of what your original question was sort of alluding to, and for me, alienation of the police and separating them from other agencies and the community can be nothing but a bad thing. The more that they're involved with youth, not in always a confrontational way, the more they're involved with other agencies and build up the trust and work together to solve a problem, the better. I think, unfortunately, because of cuts and the situation at the moment, police are doing less and less of that work. And the trouble is, it's not always quantifiable. And in this day and age, when you're talking about value for money, it's very difficult to measure a police officer who's doing community work or involved with other agencies. You can measure how many arrests they make, but that necessarily doesn't equate to an effective police officer long term, or what the community even wants.
So Bill, in one of the communities I worked in, one of the youth projects had a difficult relationship with young people in cars who shouldn't have been coming to a youth club. And we had to go and ask the chief inspector. And what he did was deploy a police officer for 6 months to work in the youth club.
Yeah.
And once that happened, when those people turned up in cars to intimidate youth workers, who obviously can't deal with that kind of behaviour, once they realised there was a police officer working in there, they soon stopped. and it just allowed that youth project to carry on as it should do, with part-time workers, and obviously the young people, could thrive in it. And actually the young people in cars, I think, probably thought that's not a good idea after all in future. It might have saved them from, further kind of, confrontations. It's just an example, and it's just such a pity that, as you say, that the level of neighbourhood policing, because of the reduction of 2,000 police officers in Greater Manchester, which is incredible, meant that that's not the priority in policing, or it's much less of a priority, and that's one of the big issues. It's not everything, of course, as we've said. No. There's a lot of other things that need to be done as well.
Brilliant. Well,
I don't know.
I think we've come to the end of our questions. We've had a couple more comments kind of agreeing with that, and same as what you just said then, of kind of, it seems very much around the context in which you're interacting with the police. So if you're interacting with the police, on that bus on the way to an ice skating activity, or in a community centre, or kind of in a almost positive situation, rather than, almost, it's learnt behaviour, isn't it? At the end of the day, if your first interaction with somebody is negative, you tend to have a negative perspective going forward, don't you? Whereas if it's done in a more positive light, then you've got that as a reference point then, don't you, going forward as well?
Sure, and I think that's the key issue. And it's, as I say, this is not just about policing, it's about a whole range of different agencies that need to work very positively together. And so, violence, the public health approach and the violence reduction strategy, based on Police Scotland, Glasgow experience, and our Boston Friends experience, seems to be the right way forward. And I'm glad that Greater Manchester Combined Authority have got this approach now, and we just need to keep our eyes on it. So as students came, when the pandemic's over, which it will come eventually, I promise. When we get back to normal behaviour and students come to class, to either in the criminology degree or in the public service degree, the potential to do research, and maybe in the second year to go and do work experience in some of these agencies, is one we're really keen to support. So it might be that, for instance, you did your research around this area and you'd go and interview police officers, people from the Combined Authority, and you get a real good insight into it. And so when it came to your career choice, whatever it was, you've got some real experience here, and real, and in a sense, just to finish that bit off, that's what, in a sense, in the recruitment, when employers are going to look at people who've got those kind of experiences, who've got that inside knowledge, and have got that kind of experience, they want to see not just the university experience, but what else have you done? What else have you kind of gained from this? So the possibilities of doing, certainly in the second years of the degree, there's a big focus on trying to do work experience. Obviously this year we couldn't do that because of the pandemic, but once that vaccination program is finished, we'd like to get our students back in to doing what you call primary research based in some of the youth organisations, some of the criminal justice organisations which they've been involved in, and maybe they could look at, maybe there'd be some areas around knife crime that we could look at, placing students in as well. So it's a big area of possibility, both from public service and from criminal justice. perspectives. That we could encourage people, students, potential students, and actual students to become involved in. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, Bill, have you got anything else to add? If not, I think we might finish it up there. So we seem to come to the end of our questions.
No, I think Don summed that up very nicely there. So no, nothing else to add.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, both. We hope that those of you who have attended have really enjoyed this, and it's really great to have you so engaged in the debate and giving your thoughts on the situation, which is hugely complex, really, isn't it? So thank you very much. If you do want to find out any more about us, you can access our website, ucenmanchester.ac.uk anytime, and you can also make inquiries or applications via there. Thank you very much, Don and Bill, for your time. Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, just they could also email us if they want.
Yeah.
I'll pop that. Questions.
Yeah. Well, if there are any other questions, I'll pop the emails in the chat, which is just on your right hand side, as well as our website, and then you can access them and email us from there. But thank you very much for participating. It's been a great debate.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.
Bye bye. Bye bye. Bye bye.